Hello, my name is Tammy Rose, and welcome to Concord Days. My mother, Fatima Rose, always believed that we should live in harmony with Mother Nature. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a very special show to talk about Native American history around Concord, around Massachusetts, and we're going to have a really great discussion today. With me, I have my co-host, Richard Smith.
Hi, Tammy.
Hey,
how are you? Nice to see you again. My name is Richard Smith. I am a Concord historian and writer, and Tammy's exactly right. We have a very special guest today. It is our pleasure to welcome to Concord Days Larry Spotted Crow Mann of the Nipmuc tribe of Massachusetts. Hi, Larry. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Richard, Fatima. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you. So as I said earlier to you, I had a chance to see you last October at the Concord Museum when you were doing your storytelling and some of your music. Absolutely wonderful. And so I guess the first question that we want to start with is, and it's kind of a general question for you, no pressure. Tell us about the Nipmuc presence in Massachusetts, if you can. Give us a kind of a brief thumbnail or a little bit longer history of the Nipmuc people, if you would not mind.
Oh, thank you. First off, once again, Kutabadamish, thank you very much for having me. And and on that same note, it's appropriate to introduce myself in my language, which is going to segue into exactly what your question is that Concord being the land of Nipmuc people, and I'm also bordering Massachusetts people, sort of on the other side there. It's important to acknowledge that space, Nipmuc space, and the language that was first spoken in Concord, which would be the Nipmuc language. And so I would like to first open up in those words and give my greeting, which we would say, Tabatni. Watuchikinisen, Okumis, Tabatni, which he's supposed to. Wasakatia Huana, Notas Nilwa Menantion, King Nuta Yu Pantaminok, and the Mayo Nilwa Mequantam Kichia, Ka Mata Wanantam, Ka Nagutie Kokutam Nilwa, Manatu, Wasakatia Huana, Womanetio, Ka Nosokomuso Amoke, Ninaho, Kankanto Chokesiche, Yayo. I greet you in the words of my ancestors, the Nipmuc people, in the words of peace, in the words of reciprocity. And that this exchange that we're going to have here today, we'll be exchanging our breath, which English does a terrible translation of that word, which is really refers to our spirit, because when we breathe, we have to breathe to talk, and we're talking, we're sharing our breath, which is essentially our spirit. So I'm essentially asking that our ancestors would be in here and share that breath and that spirit with us. And so I greet you in that words. And also, I think it's important that I would also like to kind of ground is in a drum, the drum, which is the sacred heartbeat. And you probably heard me playing it when I was at the museum as well to start off. And I think it's important to kind of, set the stage and kind of like set the tone of where we're going to take this conversation. So allow me to share this Nipmuc song here. Yeah. one behind them. Nina one behind them. Hey yo, hey yo, hey ya. Hey yo, hey yo, hey ya. Hey ha, hey ha, hey ha. Good job with the bottomish. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was
So
beautiful.
now we're good to go, right?
Yeah, so it's always important, I think, whenever our ancestrally and culturally, historically, before any conversations are started, there will be appropriate greetings and music. And you know how music always just makes us feel good. And you might have come into a meeting all upset. He's gonna hear my mouth. I'm gonna give him a good word or two. And suddenly when you're hearing a good song and you're just kind of lifted and you feel a little better. So I think that's what our ancestors had in mind. So having said that, yes, the Nipmuc means people of the fresh water. Our homelands essentially stretched within 4 states to the Connecticut River, past beyond Natick, Concord, of course, touching the tip of southern New Hampshire, Rhode Island, northern Rhode Island, and northeastern Connecticut. And my family comes from Grafton, which is the Hassanamisco, also the Wabaquasit, on the area of northeastern Connecticut today, in the Sturbridge area and Quabog. And so essentially, every Nipmuc person who's alive today is somehow related through these families that survived. And so it's a real grateful thing to be here with you. And I've been teaching history and culture and singing and traveling about 3 decades now. I have some books that I'll share in a little bit to talk about my writings, which have taken me around the world and of course to Concord. Most recently, I've been at the Concord Museum the last 2 years for the grand opening. Was really really a lot of fun. I met some politicians there. Congresswoman Trahan, I think.
Yep.
Hope I said it.
Yep.
Congressman, not Representative.
Her name is Lori. Yeah, Lori Trahan.
Yes, Lori Trahan, and so it was really great to share that space with them, and open up the museum and have all the kids there and sing. And I remember singing, and people were involved in all kinds of different things. And suddenly, when they heard the drum, everybody came surrounding around. So again, you see the power of the drum whenever it's heard. And so my younger relative, Brittany Wally, who did some work in the museum, she created some weave work. And so it's really exciting to have our cultural footprint, as it were, back in Concord. Most of the Nipmucs today don't live near Concord in terms of not too close to Concord. Most of the Nipmucs stay around Grafton, northeastern Connecticut, as I said, the Western Mass area. Concord was certainly one of the original towns of our people. And we know, as I'm sure you know, Richard, to start off as a fur trading town was lucrative in the fur, and Willard and those folks who came through there and, setting up trade and earlier praying town. So so you can imagine Native people were not welcome there early on, so we were kind of like chased away from that spot because it was a very lucrative spot for the early arrivals. And so, and also, I guess in more recent history, back in the 90s, my cousin Star, Bruce Curlis, with the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness, where we're having powwows at the Concord, the high school there, and between there and Maynard, we're doing powwows there, and it'll really be great we can get that going again. Of course, post COVID and all that, to get more activity up there. And so we're really excited actually to have this involvement with the museum, because it's been so long since our Nipmuc people of today have been able to spend time in Concord in that sense. And as we were talking earlier, there's so much history there, whether we're talking about Jethro and the lake and all that. I live here in Webster, and what we call Webster. We have a sacred lake here as well. And so it's very understandable that lake would be sacred. And in our name, Nipmuc, water means life, water, people of the fresh water. So water was a very essential part of our people. When you think about the rivers and all these different things, which are our highways and so forth. So it was a very significant part for our community, especially being an outpost. And as I mentioned earlier, the Nipmuc people of the Concord area were neighbors with the Massachusetts people, tribal, who are on that side of the border. So they had to have good relations with them, and then down a little south to the Wampanoag people as well.
So before the English arrived in 1620, were the Nipmucs, were they farmers? Were they hunter gatherers? Did they move about the area? What was seasonal life like for them before the English arrived?
Yeah, great question. So they were, I guess, what the term is used, as semi-nomadic. So during the springtime, we would, of course, find ourselves near the rivers, getting the shad and the eels, which is a Nipmuc delicacy, and the salmon, which were very abundant at the time. And then we'd also head out to the coast to share with our Wampanoag brothers to get the catches there, the herring, and the different the cod and things like that they were catching, and whale and so on, and exchange some of the meats that we would get inland, like the bear, deer, elk, beaver, and so on. And of course, and I tell people when they talk about seasons, today's seasons are divided into four, four parts of the year, quarters. But Nipmuc seasons are each month. Every month is essentially a season where we have a moon ceremony. So, for example, in June would be a strawberry moon ceremony. We'd have a ceremony around getting strawberries. And right now we're in March, moon, maple sap moon. So we're gathering our sap. And so whatever the geography was calling us to do at that time, that's where our community would be. And so we would never be in one place. And this is why the reservation system is so it's an anathema to people surviving. No human beings are meant to stay up in one place, as it depletes the area in so many different ways. And when you're talking about indigenous knowledge, epistemology, you're talking about people who've studied the landscape for thousands of years, and they had a very good understanding about how to relate to it after this, many eons of observation. And they knew that you needed to move on. They knew how to deal with the ground, like, for example, our polyculture, where our three sisters growing technology, where you're growing different plants together at the same time. And so they were very intuitive in terms of how to live on the land. So they were always moving around, never staying in one place.
Yeah.
And did they have obviously they must have had a pretty good relationship with the other nations that were living around, like the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag? Was there a lot of trading and cultural exchanges between the nations?
Absolutely, yes, all the time. And for the most part, we got along quite well with all the neighboring communities here. Probably our biggest adversaries before contact were the Haudenosaunee people, the Mohawk. They were probably the most, I guess, threat to us at the time. But even with them, there were long stretches of peace and mutuality without heavy losses. Even when the warfare was documented, it's not like it was about wiping out an entire community. So it was always like a few members would probably die during the battle, or sometimes people were captured and so on.
Yeah.
And I think I had asked you this when I saw you at the museum back in October. Before contact, any idea what the Nipmuc population might have been before and then after European contact?
That's a great question, and it's still being debated. And it's really hard to really land that down, because every time, the more evidence they look into, the more the numbers keep going up. Charles Mann, no relation, did a wonderful book, 1491, and he really talked about that in great detail. Whereas, everything that we know about the number of population, how long people been here, and so forth, will really have to be fundamentally changed in terms of the evidence that now stands. But what we do know is that what scientists roughly say now is that before contact, you're talking in North America alone, there were roughly 15 to 20 million Native American people here. That's a number that a lot of scientists on both sides kind of agree with. And so, but what we do know, by the time of the 1800s, the U.S., the Native American census population in the 1800s was 237,000. So that's a genocide rate of about 90%. So we do know these factors are weighing heavy on the mortality and the life of indigenous people today. And so that's what we do know. And just taking the fact that the Nipmuc homeland was so large, as I said, 4 states, what now is 4 states, you consider people were living a long time. There was forms of birth control, but it wasn't used very frequently. Food was always in plenty. So, I mean, with these factors, populations can continue to grow. And there's documents where Champlain, who didn't want to, who kept sailing up north when he stopped here on the Cape, he wanted to keep going because it said there was too many people here. So it's taking these factors. I think we just don't know how many, but it's certainly a lot more than what was estimated at the time. And I think a lot of times to keep these numbers low is to kind of assuage the genocide and the monstrous, murderous acts that taken place here.
Right. That way they can say, well, it was bad, but it wasn't that bad.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the inherited histories that we have, it's like the Thanksgiving myth, and everybody was totally fine. The Pilgrims and Native Americans got along great, and the numbers just kept decreasing as if by magic or something like that.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I can I can totally shift into my book here, and so I tried to deal with that. Thanksgiving problem when I wrote my book, The Morning Road to Thanksgiving. This was the 2015 Native American Circle of Writers winner. And I've been very excited about this book here, and I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of this. It's so relevant not only for understanding Thanksgiving, the history of America, but also race relations and essentially what's still going on today. And I'm very happy to say this book is being used in many scholarly sectors in terms of education, social sciences, native studies, and so on. Universities and high schools are using this. The recommended reading is ages 16 and up, but certainly younger folks can read it. It's been a great conversation piece around these different discussions. So I'm really excited about what this book has been doing. And by the way, on the cover, this is my second youngest son, Anoki, when he was about 9 years old. The kid is 22 years old now. And so we're actually in Montreal singing, performing there. And this photographer from France took this iconic photo. So as I was developing this book, I was thinking about a cover for it. And this, I thought this would be very powerful to have him, Anoki, on there. So
exactly.
We're really happy.
Yeah, no, especially also because I'm sort of guessing that the history is more closely passed on through the families and through the community. It's not necessarily like a written thing that I feel like a lot of the Europeans came in and they're like, if there's not a written language, then, like that's the marker of the advancement of culture. When, it's like cultures can express themselves in so many different ways. And,
Yeah, you bring up, that's actually a fascinating point you bring up, because there were many forms of writing that were here, but however, it was not respected. First and foremost, the Wampum Belt, as it's called, which is really more of a wampum letter. The Wampum Belt was actually ways to mnemonically tell stories and about people's histories, lives, and clan, and so on. So there was information being passed. And secondly, there were scrolls. Some are still preserved today from the Ojibwe people, these birch bark scrolls that were written on, and much like Chinese characters, they would symbolize writing such as that. And so people would use stones and trees and different things like that. For example, you have the trees that will point to different locations of water and so on. So there are many ways that we are using nature around us to do this communicating and writing. And so I think it's important to really emphasize that there was various forms of writing. And then having said that, and I always love to talk about one of my ancestors, James the Printer, who was one of the first students at Harvard. And many people don't realize Harvard University was first an Indian school. So back in the 1640s, when Minister Eliot was going around setting up these praying towns like in Concord, one of the first things they needed to do is, if they wanted to turn natives into Christians, they needed to be able to understand the Bible. So one of my ancestors, James the Printer, was one of the native students who was at Harvard, who worked with Minister Green to set up the printing press and was developing the Bible in the Nipmuc language. So it stands today as the first Bible ever translated in the native language. And there's a copy of that today at the Natick Library. And so, and it wasn't just him. There was another scholar, Benjamin Larnell, who we just recently named the scholarship. And he was a Nipmuc scholar who died at the age of 17, who was writing about Plato and Socrates. And by the way, everybody who was college learned back then, we're speaking 4 or 5 languages, Greek and Latin and all that. So it wasn't really, you were doing that. You just had to learn it if you wanted to get into these universities. Today, it's kind of, dropped from that. So it was really amazing how quickly Native people, once they were exposed to this type of communication, they were quickly catching on. And incidentally, James the Printer would use that writing when he posted that tree on the Charles River, saying during the King Philip's War that know by this paper that the Indians you have brought to wrath and war in this day. So it was kind of like, okay, I'll use this writing now to my advantage, like speak my truth to you.
So did you grow
and I'm also glad that you brought up. Oh, go ahead, Richard.
I was going to ask him. So did you grow up bilingual, speaking English and Nipmuc, or how did you learn the language?
I learned the language later in life, and that's a very it's a very tragic story. So my great grandmother and the generations before her spoke the language, and what happened was they were not allowed to speak the language. They were told not to speak it. You couldn't get work, and actually, my grandparents learned it by listening to their parents speak it when they were in bed at night. They would hear them talking the language because they were trying not to pass it on. And so eventually what happened was by the time of my mother's generation, a lot of that hasn't survived in terms of speaking it fluently in the family. But there were a few family members and tribal members in the community who did preserve it. And through the help of the Eliot Bible, actually, the Nipmuc dictionary, and our linguists that remained in the family, the Nipmuc language was able to survive, and it thrives on today. And I want to say, sadly, my cousin David Tallpine, who passed during this pandemic, he was our main language teacher, and he was just an amazing person. And maybe you've heard of him. He did many talks such as I was, and a lot of times people would confuse me for him because we'd be on so many different programs, and so he was a very important figure in our tribe and a very loved family member that we dearly miss. And he was very powerful in teaching that language, and so he's dearly missed. And so today, because of him and a few others like him, that we have a resurgence in our language, and our kids are learning it, and we have CDs and different things now, part of this program. And so and by the way, I need to mention that I'm the director of the Okiteo Cultural Center, and so a lot of this work is funneled through this organization here. So if you want to learn more about the work that we're doing, please go to okiteau.org, OKETEAU.org, and we can pass on the information to you after.
We'll make sure that anything that you talk about during this will be linked below on the YouTube channel so that people can check all of these things out.
And so usually when I do talks, a lot of questions that people ask me is, how can I get involved? How can I support? Because, we really want to get that intentional relationship, right? And so part of that is how you can be a better ally, how you can get involved and help Nipmucs have the things that they should have, according to the treaties and so on. And so, go to okiteo.org and you'll see a lot of information there. And so real quick, I know we don't have a whole lot of time. I just want to share, this is my latest book here, Drumming and Dreaming. It's a collection of tribal legends, and it's all place-based stories that are about this area, including like the Three Sisters stories. And so that's the beautiful thing about our culture, that it really talks about the place. You could find these places, whether it's Concord or Webster or Grafton and things like that. You can go to that, and that's how you really become planted in place, and you really have that cultural and spiritual understanding. And these are the things that were taken away from Indigenous people. And real quickly, this is my first book, Tales from the Whispering Basket. Really excited when this first came out. It's a collection of short stories and poetry, and I always say I'm a poet first, so you can check that out. And,
I have that book.
Oh, great. And I think probably something I'm the most excited about is the work I do with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health on drug and alcohol prevention for Native American teens. Between the year of 2014 and 2016, we had 24 opiate deaths or suicide of Native youth in the state.
My God.
We were losing one child a month for 2 years due to all the many things I just discussed in terms of not having access to health disparities, cultural depravity, and so on, all the different things that our communities had suffered. So working with some tribal leaders in the Mass Department of Public Health and the Institute for Native Studies at UMass Boston. We created these curriculum life skills guides here for middle school children. And what this does is it's a life skills training that bases healthy practices on traditional teachings, where traditional stories are encapsulated within teachings of how to make better choices, how to say no to drugs, how to bullying preventing, and healthy lifestyles, and so on. And so we can tell a kid just say no when somebody's offering you a marijuana or a drink, but we know that's not easy. So when you hear them in the stories of how the trickster dealt with something, or a story of Crow or Beaver, you then begin to kind of conceptualize how these spirits and these animals went through this thing, and you can see yourself in that story of how you're going to be able to get out of a situation. And this is how our ancestors did it for thousands of years, in terms of our education, dealing with the natural world, and diplomacy, and all different things.
So have you, speaking of cultural shifts, have you noticed a change? So it seems the last several years, the white world is slowly catching on to the idea that the native peoples have always been here. So we have Indigenous People Day. Thanksgiving often is honored as a national day of mourning, things like that. Are you noticing a subtle shift in people's awareness about native peoples and the fact that you are indeed still here?
Oh, Richard, that's a really profound question. I'm really glad you asked that, because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I don't have time to get into it here, but growing up as a kid in Springfield was probably the worst time of my life as a Native person. And I shared that story many times in many venues. And so seeing what I'm seeing today compared to when I was a kid, I am ecstatic in so many different ways. I can't tell you, to see the allyship, to see people woke, right? That's the term they're using now. And we still have a long way to go, but I am very optimistic about the trajectory that we're moving on. I mean, when you look at the political sphere, you see some of the craziness. It can be very disheartening, but at the same time, it's a reaction. It's triggered by the awareness, by the enlightenment of that people are experiencing in terms of race relations, in terms of oppression, in terms of gender rights, in terms of violence. And so people are getting triggered by it because like a scholar and friend, Mark Charles, would say, who are the people that gets most uncomfortable when we talk about race? It's white people, right? That's not a doubt. So it's a trigger there, and so they're upset, and it's also goes into the same sphere as grief, right? The 5 stages of grief. The first is denial, and then you get angry, and so we're seeing all these different things manifest in that same sense. Those who don't want to challenge their critical notions of reality, and what they're juxtaposing that against what they would expect for their own families and their self-determination. But those who are willing to do that are seeing like, holy crap, what have we done? And how can I be a part of this change? And so it's a really beautiful thing to be in this movement. Being in my 50s now, seeing the young Nipmucs and Native people and allies alike doing this stuff, it's a dream. I'm seeing things I didn't think I'd ever see. Growing up, as I said, in middle school, where the teachers were telling me Indians were gone and being abused by teachers and other kids alike, and just being taught essentially that I was a hapless bystander benefiting from white proximity, was the message that myself and other Native kids were seeing. And considering the fact from kindergarten to college, a Native person would not see anybody of their own race in a teaching position. But what they would see is mascots. And what they would hear is disparaging comments about their race. So what does that do to the psyche? What does that do to the fundamental growth of a person? And so we are seeing this great change that I'm so happy that it's coming along.
Yeah. And I would also add to like that piece of education where like in America, I feel like you brought up King Philip's War, which is something that really doesn't get taught even in the normal curricula. But that's sort of like the first, major struggle and documented struggle between, the white people and Native Americans. And if you want to talk about that and sort of how you teach about that period of history, or how you communicate King Philip's War.
Absolutely. And me as a student of history and writer and so on, Nipmuc people are so intertwined with the King Philip's War. And sometimes you only hear Wampanoags and King Philip, but it's so far from what actually took place. Whereas the majority of the war, first of all, took place in Nipmuc homeland. And the majority of people who were helping Metacom were Nipmuc people. Later on, the Narragansetts would join, but it was only after they were attacked at Great Swamp just before Christmas on that cold winter day. They were trying to be neutral because they also had, they weren't exactly friends with Massasoit's son and the family at the time. So they were kind of seeing where things were going to go. But after they were attacked, they joined up, and that's when everybody met up at where Mass is today. And Mount Wachusett and so on became a stronghold. And the whole Mary Rollison story, which unfolds, again, James Prenter shows up in that as well, being a kind of a negotiator. So he has, and if people tell these stories, they have a fundamental shift in understanding. And I'm actually working on a playwright that I'm working on now about some of my ancestors who were in the Civil War. And this is another untold story that so many natives, and I wish we had more time to talk about this. First of all, I'll talk about the Revolutionary War, where many Nipmuc men, such as my great-great-great-grandfather, Sampson Hazard and Christopher Vickers, were Revolutionary War soldiers. And moving up a little bit, a few generations, their descendants would be serving in the Union Army in the Civil War. All of their brothers and cousins, they all went. And it's quite a phenomenal history that I just had to do some work on. And so I've been looking into that. And the more I read about it, the more fascinating it is to see all these men who were serving while at the same time their land was being usurped and their children being put into these boarding schools. So it's a really jarring story.
Oh, well, and frankly, as a fellow playwright, I want to let you know that we're also working on a podcast to do like pieces of history. And I would love to have either your whole play or just a few scenes or whatever. So let's definitely keep in touch.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. Very cool.
So you're finding then, I guess, that people are finally coming around to the realization that gee, there are still Native people in the United States, and they've been involved in all walks of life. I think that a lot of people still don't quite get that, to tell you the truth.
Yes, you're right. And it's still, as I said, it's still a long way to go. And the work that I do and many other Native people do it, and sometimes you'll hear them say is that we don't want to do the work for you. Like, go and do some research. And for example, like my cousin Brittany, she's been on these different boards and in this legislative board in the state to remove mascots, and she's going town by town by town. And it's exhausting at times telling white people that this is racist, this is wrong. Whereas if you put that any other culture, any other race in that same position, you'll be appalled by what's being done. So it's really like blows our mind that people can't really draw that conclusion that this is racist. This is this menstrual show like attitude towards indigenous bodies and culture and art, where they become the art, the entertainment for others to enjoy. And so that's the work that we have to do, and it's important that allies. And I heard someone say, a Native scholar say recently, that when he was talking to white allies, and many of them may have family members who are not understanding, much like what you said, who are just like ignorant or just very recalcitrant, wanting to understand what this is about. And he said to them, you as allies, white allies, you have access to these people nobody else will have. So when you're hearing a racist joke, when you're hearing something that's untrue, you can't, sometimes we've been accustomed to just, that's just Uncle so-and-so, and it's something I'm really reflecting on as well, is that you really have to disrupt it every time. Every time you hear it, we have to disrupt it, because racism, bigotry, oppression will not stop, because it's, I was just doing some physics stuff. It needs that inertia, right, to change its velocity. So if it's not disrupted, it's just going to keep going. It's not going to go away by its own. So, and I tell, young people out there and so on, of course, do it safely, but wherever you can, you got to disrupt the bigotry, speak up. When you're seeing somebody's gender or race or something being said that's, not in a good terms. And for example, right now, you're seeing a lot of pushback about the cartoons, The Cat in the Hat, and all these different things. And again, it's another example of not people loving history, but people loving nostalgia. They hate history, right, but they love nostalgia, and so
they think that they're the same thing. They're nostalgic for this racist past, and they confuse that with being real history.
Exactly. And Lee Francis, another writer, he wrote a beautiful piece about this. Talking about how we as human beings, we're constantly creating, we're constantly doing new things. So you're holding on to these racist ideologies as if you couldn't create something new, something more better, something more fitting. And, we're really not willing to challenge and ask ourselves that question. Why am I holding on to this? Of course, we can remember and have fond memories as a child of certain things that we did, but it doesn't mean we have to use that and weaponize that as to be in opposition to something that's changing around us, that is good for everybody.
Yes. Oh my God. Well, and thank you so much for educating us, for helping us disrupt all of the negative stereotypes that just will help us all become kinder people and
Yes,
just more open to actual history.
Right. And in Concord especially, it's a very significant point for the Revolutionary War. Obviously, I mean, there's so much history around Concord that it would be very beautiful to see a very in-depth research looking into the Native history there and talking about the Nipmuc people in a very robust, in the same way that the Revolution is discussed about. And I think it will reveal a really beautiful story and really create some more awareness in that sense.
Exactly. Like there's so much I want to talk about with you. So yeah.
I think Tammy and I know enough historians here in town that we can get that thing rolling.
That'd be awesome.
If we're going to talk about April 19th and transcendentalism, why can't we talk about the Nipmucs and King Philip's War?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, so Larry, this has been an absolute pleasure. I wish we had more time to talk, but thank you so much for joining us and for enlightening our audience about the history of your people and the history of yourself. And it's been a real pleasure having you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm so thankful to be here, Richard and Fatima. Thank you for having me. And again, if anybody wants more information about the things that we're doing, go to okiteo.org. Really be happy to have you as an ally and join this cause with us. And so once again, I thank you and look forward to seeing you guys in the summer.
We're looking forward to it as well. And for those of you that have been joining us today, thank you so much for joining in. And we look forward to talking to you again on Concord Days.
Thank you.